Margaret Chen lived in apartment 4B at Riverside Senior Living. She was 71 years old with silver hair she kept in a simple bun and hands that showed every one of those years. Her fingers were bent in places, swollen at the knuckles from arthritis that had crept in slowly over the past decade. Some days were better than others. Some days she could barely hold a coffee cup without wincing, but she still played her piano. The piano itself was nothing special to look at. It sat against the far wall of her small living room, an old upright that had seen better days. The wood finish was scratched and faded, dulled by decades of afternoon sunlight streaming through the nearby window. Several of the white keys had turned yellow and a few had chips along the edges. If you looked closely, you could see the coffee ring stain on the top from that morning 10 years ago, when her late husband had set his mug down without thinking. Margaret didn't mind any of it. That piano had been with her for 47 years. It had survived 3 moves, 2 kids learning to play chopsticks badly and 1 grandchild who thought it was a drum set. The bench wobbled slightly when you sat down, and the middle C stuck sometimes if you didn't hit it just right. But it was hers, and when she played it, none of those things mattered. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet lady in 4B who sometimes played music in the afternoons. Nothing fancy, just simple melodies that drifted through the walls. Old songs mostly, the kind you'd hear in a movie from the 1950s. Pleasant enough, but nobody really paid attention. There were 12 apartments on the 4th floor, and Margaret was just another resident. Sweet lady, kept to herself. Played piano sometimes, that's all anyone really knew about her. Everything changed on a Tuesday in March when the building manager, Mrs. Patterson, posted a notice in the lobby. It was printed on bright yellow paper, impossible to miss, with bold letters at the top that read, "Special Visitor Announcement." The residents gathered around it like kids around a birthday cake. Mrs. Patterson had organized something special, the notice said. A real treat. Victor Stanislavski, the famous concert pianist, would be visiting Riverside Senior Living next Thursday as part of his community outreach tour. The name sent a ripple of excitement through the building. Even people who didn't follow classical music knew who Victor Stanislavski was. He'd been on television. He'd played at Carnegie Hall. The Queen of England had attended one of his concerts. He was the kind of famous where people who couldn't tell a piano from a xylophone still recognized his name. For 3 days, that yellow notice was all anyone talked about. In the cafeteria, by the mailboxes, in the elevator, everyone had an opinion. Mrs. Chen from 4B just smiled politely when people asked if she was excited. She said yes, of course, that would be lovely. Then she went back to her apartment and continued her routine. Thursday arrived with unusually good weather. Sunny, warm for March, the kind of day that made people feel optimistic. The common room on the 1st floor had been cleaned and arranged with extra chairs. Someone had brought flowers. Mrs. Patterson wore her nicest dress and checked her watch every 30 seconds. Victor Stanislavski arrived at exactly 2 o'clock in a black car with tinted windows. He stepped out wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about him screamed precision. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. When he walked, he moved with the kind of confidence that comes from performing in front of thousands of people and receiving standing ovations. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single glance. Mid-40s, at the absolute peak of his career. This tour of retirement communities wasn't something he'd sought out. His publicist had suggested it after that article in the Times about wealthy artists being out of touch with regular people. 3 weeks, 10 communities show the world that Victor Stanislavski cared about the common folk. He smiled as Mrs. Patterson greeted him. It was a professional smile, practiced, the kind that looked genuine in photographs but didn't quite reach his eyes. He shook hands with residents, nodded at their stories, and said all the right things. How wonderful. What an interesting hobby. You don't say. Margaret watched from the doorway of the common room. She'd come down when her daughter Linda had called, insisting she should meet the famous pianist. Linda worked as a nurse at the hospital downtown, but had taken the afternoon off to be there. She stood beside her mother now, practically vibrating with excitement. Mom, can you believe it? Victor Stanislavski. Right here. Margaret just nodded, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Patterson was showing Victor around. introducing him to residents who wanted to share their talents. Mr. Rodriguez showed him a painting he'd done. Mrs. Kim demonstrated her knitting. Everyone wanted a moment with the famous pianist, a story they could tell later. Then Mrs. Patterson suggested they visit some of the apartments, see how the residents really lived. Victor agreed with that same professional smile, checking his watch so quickly most people didn't notice. But Margaret noticed. When they reached the 4th floor, Linda spoke up. "My mother lives here. She plays piano too." Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up. "Oh, that's perfect. Mr. Stanislavski, you must see Mrs. Chen's piano." Victor nodded graciously, and the small group made their way to apartment 4B. Margaret led the way, moving slowly, her keys jingling as she unlocked her door. The apartment was small but tidy. A modest couch, a television, family photos on the walls, and there, against the far wall, her piano. Victor's expression shifted the moment he saw it. Not dramatically, just a subtle change that someone who wasn't watching closely might have missed. His eyes swept over the old upright, taking in its condition in a single glance. The faded finish, the yellowed keys, the general wear that spoke of an instrument past its prime. He approached it the way you might approach a museum exhibit behind glass. Interested, but distantly so. Clinical. He ran one finger along the closed lid, leaving a faint trail in the thin layer of dust that had settled there despite Margaret's cleaning. "You play?" he asked, turning to look at her. His accent was thick, Eastern European, each word carefully pronounced. There was something in his tone, not quite dismissive but close, the tone of someone asking a question they already know the answer to. Margaret met his gaze. "A little," she said quietly. Linda shifted uncomfortably beside Victor. She'd heard that tone. She didn't like it. But her mother seemed unfazed, moving to the piano bench and lowering herself onto it carefully. The bench creaked slightly under her weight. Victor glanced at his watch again, then back at the piano. A smile played at the corners of his mouth. It was the kind of smile that said everything. He'd seen this before. Elderly woman. Old piano. Simple melody. Sweet but forgettable. Another box to check on his community service tour. "Please," he said, making a small gesture with his hand. "Don't let me stop you." He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. His posture said it all. Polite, patient, but already mentally somewhere else. Already thinking about his next appointment, his next real performance, his next flight to a city where pianos were worth more than cars and audiences understood what they were hearing. Margaret's hands moved to the keys. They trembled slightly, those bent arthritic fingers finding their positions. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She could see it in his stance, in that knowing smile, in the way he touched her piano like it might be contagious. She'd seen that look before. Many times. She'd spent 50 years being underestimated. The first notes came out hesitant, almost apologetic. Margaret's fingers moved slowly across the keys, working through the stiffness that always came at the beginning. Her arthritis made those first few moments difficult. The joints needed time to warm up, to remember what they once knew without thinking. Victor remained by the doorframe, his expression unchanged. He'd heard this before, the uncertain start, the simple melody that would follow. He'd sat through dozens of performances like this in the past 3 weeks. Retirement homes, community centers, library basements. Everyone wanted to show the famous pianist what they could do, and they were all, without exception, exactly what he expected. Sweet, well-meaning, forgettable. He watched Margaret's bent fingers struggle with the opening phrase. The middle C stuck just like it always did, and she had to press it twice. Victor's slight smile grew a fraction wider. He wasn't being cruel, not exactly. Just realistic. This was what happened when people let their skills fade, when they settled for instruments that should have been retired decades ago. Mrs. Patterson stood near the door, beaming with pride at having orchestrated this moment. Linda watched her mother with a mixture of encouragement and worry. She'd heard her mom play before, of course. Birthday parties, Christmas gatherings. Simple songs that made people smile. But standing here next to a world-famous pianist, with her mother's hands shaking and that old piano making sounds like a rusty gate, Linda felt her stomach tighten with second-hand embarrassment. Victor shifted his weight, uncrossing his arms just long enough to check his watch again. 2:17. He told his driver to be ready by 2:30. That gave him 13 minutes. He could endure 13 minutes of amateur piano. He'd endured worse, but then something changed. It was subtle at first. So subtle that Victor almost missed it. Margaret's fingers, which had been moving tentatively through the opening bars, suddenly found their rhythm. The hesitation vanished. Her hands, those arthritic, trembling hands, began to move with a fluidity that seemed impossible. The simple melody Victor had been expecting never came. Instead, what emerged from that old battered piano was something else entirely. The notes grew complex, layered, demanding. This wasn't Fur-Elise or Moonlight Sonata, or any of the predictable pieces amateurs played to impress visitors. This was something deeper, darker, more technically challenging. Victor's smile faded. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on Margaret's hands with the intensity of someone who'd just noticed something that shouldn't be there. Something that didn't fit. The piece she was playing required serious skill, real training, the kind that took years to develop and a lifetime to master. The left hand was maintaining a complex bass line while the right hand danced through intricate runs that would challenge even accomplished pianists. And she was doing it on a piano with sticky keys and uneven action, making it look effortless. No, not effortless. That wasn't the right word. She was working hard. You could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way her breath came measured and deep. But she was succeeding. Despite the arthritis, despite the inadequate instrument, despite everything working against her, she was actually pulling it off. Victor straightened up slowly, unfolding his arms. He took a step closer to the piano, then another. His professional detachment was cracking, replaced by something else. Curiosity, confusion, and underneath it all, the first stirrings of genuine interest. The music filled the small apartment. It shouldn't have sounded this good. The piano was old, out of tune in places, some of the felt hammers worn down to nothing. But somehow Margaret was drawing sounds from it that transcended its limitations. She knew exactly how to compensate for its flaws, which keys to press harder, which to treat gently, how to make the imperfections part of the music itself. Linda's mouth had fallen open slightly. She'd never heard her mother play like this. Never knew she could. The woman sitting at the piano bench didn't look like her mom anymore. She looked like someone else entirely. Someone Linda had never met. The piece Margaret was performing was obscure. Victor recognized it immediately, and that recognition sent a chill down his spine. It was a composition by Josef Palenicek, a Czech composer from the 1940s whose work had been largely forgotten outside academic circles. Victor himself had only attempted this particular piece once, during his conservatory days, and had found it so emotionally demanding that he'd never returned to it. And here was this elderly woman in a modest apartment, playing it from memory, not just playing it, interpreting it, understanding it. Every phrase she played carried weight, carried meaning. This wasn't someone who'd learned the notes and called it good. This was someone who knew what each note meant, what story it was trying to tell, what emotion it was supposed to evoke. The technical proficiency was impressive enough. The way she handled the difficult passages in the middle section, the rapid alternating octaves that required both strength and precision, the sudden dynamic shifts from fortissimo to pianissimo. But it was more than technique. It was the way she shaped each musical phrase, the subtle rubato she employed, the emotional arc she was constructing measure by measure. Victor found himself moving closer without realizing it. He was standing right next to the piano now, close enough to see Margaret's face. Her eyes were closed. She'd gone somewhere else, somewhere far away from this small apartment in this retirement community. The music was taking her back, pulling her into memories that Victor couldn't see but could somehow feel. There was pain in the music, loss, but also beauty, joy, a whole lifetime compressed into sound waves and vibrations. This was the kind of playing that couldn't be taught in any conservatory. It came from lived experience, from decades of carrying something precious inside and finally letting it out. Mrs. Patterson had stopped smiling. She was watching Margaret with wide eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. The lady from Forby who played simple melodies sometimes. Who was she really? What had they all missed? Victor's trained ear caught details that the others couldn't hear. The way Margaret handled the transition into the second movement, the fingering she chose for the difficult chromatic runs, the pedaling technique she employed to sustain the resonance despite the piano's limitations. These were choices that revealed years of serious study, decades of dedication, the kind of foundation that could only be built through intensive training under expert guidance. His heart was beating faster. He felt something building in his chest, a pressure that he didn't understand and couldn't name. When had he last felt this way listening to music? When had he last been surprised? Moved, challenged by a performance? He performed for royalty. He recorded for major labels. Critics called him the finest pianist of his generation, and yet standing here in this cramped apartment, listening to an old woman play an older piano, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt humbled. The piece was reaching its climax. Margaret's hands flew across the keys with an intensity that seemed to contradict everything about her frail appearance. The arthritis didn't matter anymore. The pain didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the music and what it demanded of her. Victor realized his vision was blurring. He blinked, surprised to feel moisture at the corners of his eyes. When had that happened? He didn't cry. He couldn't remember the last time music had moved him to tears. He'd heard the greatest performances of his lifetime. He'd played at venues where the acoustics were perfect and the audiences understood every nuance. But this was different. This was real in a way that concert halls could never be. This was someone pouring their soul into an instrument that barely worked, in a room with bad acoustics for an audience of 4 people, and it was the most genuine, the most powerful music he'd heard in longer than he could remember. The final notes hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, slowly fading into silence. Margaret's hands remained on the keys for a long moment as if she wasn't quite ready to let go. Then slowly she lifted them and placed them in her lap. Her breathing was heavy, labored from the exertion. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking as if waking from a dream, and the room came back into focus. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The last notes of the piece seemed to linger in the air even after they'd faded, like the ghost of sound refusing to leave. Victor stood frozen beside the piano. His carefully maintained composure had crumbled completely. Tears ran freely down his face now, and he made no attempt to hide them or wipe them away. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at Margaret. This small elderly woman sitting on a wobbly piano bench as if she'd just performed some kind of magic trick he couldn't explain. Mrs. Patterson had her hand over her mouth. Linda was gripping the back of a chair, her knuckles white, her eyes moving between her mother and the famous pianist with an expression that said she'd somehow stumbled into an alternate universe, where nothing made sense anymore. Finally, Victor found his voice. It came out rough, scratchy, barely above a whisper. "Where did you study?" It wasn't the question Linda expected. Not "that was lovely" or "how nice" or any of the polite things people usually said after someone played piano. This was different. This was a professional asking another professional a question that mattered. Margaret turned to look at him. Her face was calm, but there was something in her eyes, a depth that hadn't been visible before. Like a door had opened and you could suddenly see into rooms you didn't know existed. "Prague Conservatory," she said simply. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Class of 1962. The words hit Victor like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. His face had gone pale. "Prague," he repeated almost to himself. Then louder, more urgently. "You studied under Professor Novak?" Margaret nodded once. "For 3 years. Before I came to America." Victor's legs seemed to give out. He moved to the small chair near the piano and lowered himself into it, suddenly needing to sit. His hands were shaking. He pressed them together, trying to steady them, but they kept trembling. Linda looked completely lost. "Mom, I don't understand. You never told me you went to some conservatory in Prague. You never said anything about studying with anyone." Margaret's expression softened as she looked at her daughter. "You never asked, sweetheart. But we..." Linda struggled to find words. "You gave me piano lessons when I was 8. You taught me Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You played at Dad's birthday parties. You never played like that." "You were 8, Margaret said gently. "You needed to learn basics. And your father liked the old songs. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, that's what made him happy." Victor had been staring at his hands, but now he looked up at Margaret with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Prague Conservatory in 1962, that was..." He paused, calculating. "That was one of the finest music schools in Europe. Professor Novak was legendary. He only accepted 5 students per year, 5 out of hundreds who auditioned. 6 that year, Margaret corrected quietly. He made an exception. For you. Yes. Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice. Mrs. Chen, I've been managing this building for 11 years. You've lived here for what, 8, 9? And you never once mentioned any of this. Margaret shrugged slightly, a small gesture that said more than words could. It was a long time ago, but Victor wasn't letting it go. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes searching Margaret's face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. No, you don't understand what I'm asking. Prague Conservatory, Professor Novak. That level of training, that caliber of education, you should have been performing, recording, teaching at a major institution. You should have been. He gestured helplessly at the air, trying to encompass everything she should have been, the way you just played. The interpretation, the technique, the emotional depth, that's not something that just disappears because you stop performing. That's lifetime mastery. He stood up suddenly, began pacing the small space between the piano and the window. His professional mask was completely gone now. This was raw emotion, genuine confusion, maybe even anger. Not at Margaret, but at something bigger, something that didn't make sense. Why are you here? The question came out sharper than he probably intended. Why are you in this small apartment with this broken piano playing for no one? Where have you been for the past 60 years? Why isn't the world full of your recordings? Why don't I know your name? The room fell silent again. Linda was crying now, quiet tears running down her cheeks, though she probably couldn't have explained why. Mrs. Patterson looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out what. Margaret sat very still on the piano bench. She looked down at her hands, those bent arthritic fingers that had just created such beauty. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly in the quiet room. I met my husband 3 weeks before my graduation recital. Victor stopped pacing. He turned to face her, waiting. His name was Robert Chen. He was an American engineer. His company had sent him to Prague to consult on a construction project. He came to one of our student performances, and afterward, he waited by the stage door to tell me how much he'd enjoyed the music. A small smile crossed her face, the kind that comes from remembering something sweet and distant. He was kind, funny. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. The conservatory was intense, competitive. Everyone was brilliant, everyone was fighting for the same opportunities. It was exhausting, but Robert didn't care about any of that. He just liked listening to me play. Linda had sat down on the couch, her hand over her mouth, listening to a story she'd never heard before. We started seeing each other. Coffee shops. Long walks. He'd wait for me after practice sessions that lasted until midnight. His project was supposed to last 3 months, but he kept extending it. 1 month, then another. He was falling in love with me, and I was falling in love with him. Margaret's expression shifted, became more serious. Then things changed. The political situation in Czechoslovakia was getting worse. This was 1962. The Soviet influence was growing stronger. There were rumors about restrictions coming, about borders closing, about artists being forbidden to leave. My professors were worried. Some were talking about trying to get out while they still could. Victor had gone very still. He knew this history. Every musician from Eastern Europe knew it. Robert came to me one night. He'd been called back to America. His company was pulling out all their people. Things were getting too unstable. He asked me to come with him, to marry him and come to America. She paused, her fingers absently touching the piano keys without pressing them down. I had 2 choices: stay in Prague, complete my final year, pursue the career I'd been training for since I was 6 years old, or leave with Robert, give up everything I'd worked for, start a new life in a country where I didn't speak the language well and nobody knew who I was. And you chose him, Victor said quietly. I chose him, Margaret confirmed. We left within a week. Barely had time to pack. No graduation recital. No diploma ceremony. Just gone. Linda spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. Dad never told me this story. Never mentioned Prague or any conservatory. Your father felt guilty about it for years, Margaret said. He thought he'd stolen my future. But I never saw it that way. I made a choice. Maybe it wasn't the choice another person would have made, but it was mine and I never regretted it. Victor had moved back to the chair and sat down again. His face showed a dozen different emotions, each one fighting for dominance. But your talent, your training, To just walk away from all of that. I didn't walk away from music, Margaret said firmly. Music walked with me. I just played it differently. For different people. In different places. She looked around the small apartment. At the photos on the walls showing decades of family life. Weddings, graduations, grandchildren. I played for Robert while he worked on his engineering designs at the kitchen table. I played for Linda and her brothers when they were babies and couldn't sleep. I played at church services and school recitals. I taught neighborhood kids their scales. It wasn't Carnegie Hall, but it was real. It was mine. Victor wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. When he spoke again, his voice cracked slightly. I have performed in the greatest concert halls in the world. I've played for presidents and kings. Critics have called me the finest pianist of my generation. But what you just played, the depth I heard, the understanding, the sacrifice woven into every single note. He shook his head slowly. That's something I've been chasing my entire career and never quite reached. Margaret reached over and gently patted Victor's hand. The gesture was so simple, so grandmotherly, that it seemed almost absurd given the weight of what they'd just shared. But somehow it was exactly right. You'll get there, she said softly. You're still young. You still have time to understand what music really is. Victor let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I'm 46 years old. I've been playing piano since I was 4, and you're telling me I still don't understand music? You understand technique, Margaret said. You understand performance. But understanding music? That's different. That comes from living, from loving people, from losing them. From making choices you can't take back and learning to live with them anyway. She stood up slowly from the piano bench, her movements careful and measured. The performance had taken more out of her than she'd let on. Linda immediately moved to help her, but Margaret waved her off gently. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just old bones complaining. Mrs. Patterson checked her watch and seemed startled by what she saw. Oh my goodness, Mr. Stanislavski, your schedule. Your driver. I'm so sorry, I completely lost track of time. Victor looked at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign language. His schedule? His driver? None of that seemed to matter anymore. He glanced at his watch. 2:45? He was supposed to be at his next appointment in 15 minutes, clear across town. His publicist would be furious, he didn't care. Cancel it, he said. Mrs. Patterson blinked. I'm sorry, what? My next appointment, cancel it. I'm staying here. But Mr. Stanislavski, you have commitments. The community center is expecting you. There will be press there, photographers. It's all been arranged. Then unarrange it. His tone left no room for argument. Tell them I'm ill. Tell them whatever you want. I'm not leaving. Mrs. Patterson looked helpless, glancing between Victor and Margaret as if hoping one of them would suddenly make this make sense. When no one did, she quietly excused herself and stepped into the hallway to make phone calls, her worried voice fading as she walked away. Linda was still processing everything. She looked at her mother like she was seeing a stranger. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me? About Prague, about your training, about any of it? Margaret moved to the small couch and sat down carefully. What was there to tell? It was over. That life ended the day I got on the plane with your father. I became someone else. Robert's wife. Your mother. Those roles were real. They mattered. But you gave up so much, I gained so much too, Margaret countered. 3 children. 7 grandchildren. 43 years with a man who loved me. A life full of ordinary, beautiful moments. How is that giving up? Victor had moved to the window and stood looking out at the parking lot below. His reflection in the glass showed a man wrestling with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. Finally, without turning around, he spoke. After I left Prague Conservatory, I spent 5 years competing. Every major competition in Europe. I won most of them. The prizes, the recognition, it opened every door I wanted opened. Recording contracts, concert bookings, money, fame, everything I'd worked for since childhood. He turned to face them, his expression distant. I got married when I was 32. Her name was Catherine. She was a violinist, talented, beautiful. We met at a festival in Austria. Everyone said we were the perfect couple. 2 musicians at the top of their game. Margaret watched him quietly, sensing where this was going. We lasted 3 years. 3 years of coordinating schedules. Of missing each other's performances because we were in different countries. Of growing apart while everyone kept telling us how perfect we were. When she asked for a divorce, you know what I felt? He paused, seeming to expect an answer, but no one spoke. Relief. I felt relieved. Because she was getting in the way of my career. That's what I told myself. That I needed to focus on music, that relationships were a distraction from greatness. He laughed bitterly. I was so arrogant. So stupid. Linda had tears streaming down her face again. That's not stupid. That's just being human. Making mistakes, is it? Victor asked. Because I've spent 14 years since then telling myself I made the right choice. That music was enough. That the applause and the awards and the recognition were what mattered. And then I walk into this apartment and hear your mother play. And suddenly I realize I've been lying to myself for half my life. He moved back to the chair near the piano and sat down heavily. Do you know what I heard in your playing, Margaret? Do you know what made me cry? Margaret shook her head slightly. Love. Real, deep, complicated love. The kind that costs you something. The kind that changes you. Every note you played carried the weight of actual sacrifice, of choosing people over ambition, of understanding that life is bigger than art. He looked down at his hands. I can play the notes perfectly. I always have. But I've never played with that kind of depth because I've never loved anything more than I love my own success. The room fell quiet except for the distant sound of traffic outside and Mrs. Patterson's muffled voice in the hallway still, trying to rearrange Victor's schedule. Margaret studied Victor's face for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice kind but firm. You're being too hard on yourself. The music you make matters too. Not everyone has to choose the same path I chose. The world needs artists who dedicate everything to their craft. There's honor in that. But there's no life in it, Victor said quietly. Not real life. Not the kind that sustains you when you're old and the applause stops and you're alone in a hotel room, wondering why none of it feels like it was supposed to feel. Linda wiped her eyes and looked at her mother. Did you ever miss it? Performing, I mean. The big stages. The recognition. Margaret thought about this for a moment. Sometimes, she admitted. Usually when I was tired and the kids were screaming and your father was working late again. I'd think about what might have been, the concerts I never gave, the recordings I never made, the reviews that would never be written about me. She smiled softly. But then one of you would do something sweet. Or your father would come home and kiss my forehead and tell me he was the luckiest man alive. Or I'd play a simple song and see how it made someone happy. And I'd remember that I didn't give up music. I just chose to share it differently. Victor stood up and walked back to the piano. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just feeling them. This piano, he said. It's been with you all this time? Since 1978. Robert bought it for our 10th anniversary. It's not much, but it's been enough. It's perfect, Victor said, and he meant it. It sounds exactly like it should sound. Like an instrument that's been loved and used and lived with. Concert pianos in perfect condition don't have that. They're too pristine, too perfect. They don't have stories. He turned to face Margaret. Would you teach me? The question caught everyone off guard. Linda looked up sharply. Margaret's eyebrows rose. Teach you what? You're Victor Stanislavski. You don't need teaching. I need to learn what you know, he said earnestly. Not technique, not theory, but what you understand about music that I don't. How to play with that kind of depth, that kind of truth. Margaret laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. I'm 71 years old with arthritis and a piano that sticks. You perform at Carnegie Hall. What could I possibly teach you? Everything that matters, Victor said simply. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her face flushed and worried. Mr. Stanislavski, I've rearranged some things, but your publicist is very upset. She says you have contractual obligations. She's threatening to fly here personally if you don't get back on schedule. Victor didn't even look at her. His eyes remained fixed on Margaret. Tell her I'm taking a sabbatical. A sabbatical? But you've never taken a sabbatical. You have performances booked for the next 18 months. Then cancel them. Postpone them. Do whatever needs to be done. Now he did turn to look at Mrs. Patterson, and something in his expression made her stop arguing. I'm not leaving this building until I learn what this woman has to teach me. Margaret shook her head, smiling despite herself. You're being dramatic. And foolish. You can't just throw away your career because one old lady played one piece of music. It wasn't one piece of music, Victor said. It was a revelation. It was everything I've been missing. Everything I've been doing wrong. He pulled the chair closer to the piano bench. Please, just a few sessions. A few conversations. Help me understand. I'm begging you. Margaret looked at her daughter. Linda shrugged. her expression saying this whole afternoon had become so surreal that nothing would surprise her anymore. Finally, Margaret sighed. All right. But not because I think I can teach Victor Stanislavski anything useful. Because I think you need to sit still for a while and remember why you started playing music in the first place. Victor's face lit up with a smile so genuine, so full of relief and gratitude that he looked 20 years younger. When do we start? They started the next morning at 10 o'clock. Victor arrived wearing jeans and a simple sweater, looking more like a college student than a world-renowned pianist. No designer suit, no polished shoes, just a man ready to learn. Margaret had made coffee. The apartment smelled like the vanilla creamer she liked, mixed with the faint mustiness that comes with old buildings and older furniture. Victor sat at the piano bench while Margaret settled into the chair beside him, the same chair he'd collapsed into the day before. Play something for me, she said. Anything you want. Victor thought for a moment, then launched into a Chopin nocturne. His technique was flawless. Every note precisely placed, every dynamic marking observed exactly as written. His fingers flew across the keys with the kind of mechanical perfection that takes decades to achieve. When he finished, he looked at Margaret expectantly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It was perfect." Victor's face fell. But it was just notes. Beautiful notes arranged in the right order, played at the right speed. But there was nothing of you in it. You played what Chopin wrote. You didn't play what Chopin felt. How do I do that? Margaret smiled. You stop trying to be perfect. You start trying to be honest. For the next 2 hours, they worked on just 8 measures of the nocturne. Margaret made Victor play it dozens of different ways. Faster, slower, louder, softer, with the pedal, without the pedal. She asked him questions that seemed to have nothing to do with music. What's the saddest thing that ever happened to you? What does it feel like right before you fall asleep? When was the last time you missed someone so much it hurt? Victor struggled at first. He kept defaulting to what he knew, what he'd been taught. Precision, control, perfection. But Margaret was patient. She'd spent 40 years teaching neighborhood kids to play piano. She knew how to wait for understanding to arrive. By the end of the session, something had shifted. Just slightly, just enough to notice. The 8 measures sounded different. More human. Less like a performance and more like a confession. Victor came back the next day. And the day after that. And the day after that. Mrs. Patterson had to move him into one of the empty apartments on the 3rd floor, because it became clear he wasn't leaving anytime soon. His publicist had a breakdown over the phone. His manager threatened to quit. The music press was going crazy trying to figure out where Victor Stanislavski had disappeared to and why he'd canceled a dozen high-profile performances. But Victor didn't care about any of that. For the first time in his adult life, he was learning something that actually mattered. Margaret didn't teach him technique. She taught him perspective. She told him stories about her life. About Robert and how he used to sing off-key in the shower. About Linda as a baby. How she'd stop crying the moment Margaret started playing lullabies. About the arthritis diagnosis and how she'd cried not because of the pain but because she thought it meant music was over for her. But it wasn't over, Victor said. No, Margaret agreed. It just changed. Everything changes. The question is whether you change with it or spend your life trying to hold on to something that's already gone. They played together sometimes, 4 hands on that old upright piano, working through duets that were meant for 2 perfectly tuned instruments but sounded somehow better on this imperfect one. Victor learned to compensate for the sticky keys, to find beauty in the slightly flat notes that couldn't be fixed without major repairs Margaret couldn't afford. Linda came by most afternoons after her nursing shift. She'd sit on the couch and listen, watching her mother teach one of the world's greatest pianist's lessons that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with it. One evening, 3 weeks into Victor's unexpected sabbatical, Margaret asked him to play the Palahniuk piece, the one she'd played that first day. Victor hesitated. I don't know if I can do it justice. That's not what I asked. I asked you to play it, so he did. And this time it was different. He wasn't trying to copy what Margaret had done. He was trying to find his own truth in the music. His own pain, his own loss, his own understanding. He thought about Catherine, about the divorce papers he'd signed without really feeling anything, About hotel rooms in foreign cities where he'd wake up at 3 in the morning and not remember where he was. About standing on stage receiving thunderous applause while feeling completely empty inside. The music carried all of it. It wasn't perfect. He missed a note in the second movement. His pedaling was too heavy in one section. But it was real. It was honest. It was human. When he finished, Margaret was crying. So was Linda. So was Victor. That, Margaret said softly, is what music is supposed to sound like. The next morning, Victor's manager showed up at Riverside Senior Living. He was a short man with an expensive suit and an extremely stressed expression. He found Victor having breakfast in the cafeteria with Margaret and half a dozen other residents who'd adopted him as their own personal concert pianist. Victor, please. The Berlin Philharmonic, the Royal Albert Hall. These aren't events you can just reschedule. These are institutions. They're threatening legal action. Victor looked up from his scrambled eggs. Tell them I'll be there. The manager blinked in surprise. You will? In 3 months. I need 3 more months here. Then I'll honor every commitment I've made. But I'll be doing things differently from now on. Differently how? Victor glanced at Margaret, who was smiling into her coffee. You'll see. Those 3 months passed faster than Victor expected. He practiced every day in Margaret's apartment. He played for the other residents simple songs that made them happy. He learned their names, their stories, their favorite pieces. He stopped thinking about reviews and started thinking about connection. When it was finally time to leave, Margaret walked him to his car. The same black car with tinted windows that had brought him here 4 months earlier, though it felt like a lifetime ago. Thank you, Victor said, and his voice was thick with emotion. For everything. For teaching me what matters. Margaret patted his cheek gently. You already knew. You just needed permission to remember. Will you come? To the performance in Berlin? I'll send you tickets. First-class flights. The best hotel, please, Margaret laughed. I'm 71 years old with arthritis and a fear of flying. But I'll watch the live stream if they have one. Victor hugged her, something he never did with people, and climbed into the car. 6 months later, Victor Stanislavski performed at the Berlin Philharmonic. The reviews the next day were unlike anything he'd received before. Critics noted a new depth in his playing, an emotional honesty that had been absent from his earlier work. One reviewer wrote that it was as if Stanislavski had finally stopped performing and started communicating. 3 weeks after that, Victor won a Grammy for his latest recording. During his acceptance speech, he did something unexpected. Instead of thanking his team and his management, he spoke about an elderly woman in a retirement home who'd taught him what music really meant. This award is dedicated to Margaret Chen, he said, looking directly into the camera, who reminded me that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. It's about the courage to let people hear not just your talent but your heart. The camera cut to Margaret's apartment, where she was watching the ceremony on her old television. Linda sat beside her, crying happy tears. Margaret just smiled and shook her head. Silly boy, she said affectionately, always so dramatic. But she kept the recording. She watched it sometimes when the arthritis was bad and playing had become too painful. It reminded her that music never really leaves you. It just finds new ways to be heard. Her piano still sat against the wall, its keys still yellowed, the middle C still sticky. But now when she played it, she thought about Victor. About the 3 months they'd spent working through 8 measures of Chopin. About the way change comes when you least expect it. And how sometimes the greatest performances happen in the smallest rooms for the smallest audiences. She thought about Robert, gone now for 5 years, and how he'd been right to wait by that stage door in Prague all those years ago. How choosing love over ambition hadn't been a sacrifice at all. It had been wisdom. And when she closed her eyes and placed her bent arthritic fingers on the keys, she was still that young woman at Prague Conservatory who'd learned that the most important music isn't played for crowds. It's played for the people you love in the moments that matter, with all the imperfection and beauty that comes with being fully, completely human. The piano sound filled the small apartment, slightly out of tune, perfectly imperfect, and absolutely true. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and began to play.